Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
Hello listeners. In the past, this show has spent a considerable amount of time discussing the stories of the strange lights we see in our skies. We may get to some of those stories tonight, but rather than focusing specifically on the lights in the skies, we're going to consider what happens when the damn things crash land in my beautiful country. Tonight, in this episode of Nighttime, Canadian UFO researcher Chris Rutkowski is going to join us for a no-holds-barred discussion on Canadian UFO crashes. Chris Rutkowski, if aliens or UFOs or whatever they are smart enough to get here, why the hell would they be crashing? Isn't that like at the end of a long trip to only crash? What do you make of that?
Exactly. Here they are traversing time and space across millions or perhaps billions of kilometers. They get over this little rocky planet and, they get hit by lightning or they just steer wrong and they crash it. That's remarkable. In fact, the whole idea of UFO crashes and materials left behind and this type of thing, it doesn't make sense intuitively when you think about it, but it really has captured the imagination. There's no question. It's part of the memes and the milieu of the whole UFO thing.
Yeah, that's one thing about it. Like, is absurd in a way. Like, I'll say it. As absurd as it is for them to just have this unfortunate accident after they arrive from light years and universes beyond to crash here. It's become such a part of the UFO story. There's like these certain kind of trappings with these stories that come up often. And one of them is, of course, a UFO crash. Like, I know you know so much about the history of UFOs. Does that always seem to be a part of the story? Or is there a certain point you can look back on and be like, yeah, all of a sudden UFOs started crashing?
Well, there have been a lot of cases like that over the years. In fact, the UFO Crash Retrieval Symposia, I have on my bookcase, I can see from here, many things that a number of people have worked on, many publications just listing the supposed crashes. I mean, although it's absurd, I mean, we have sophisticated jet fighters and things like that in the various militaries around the world, and some of them crash all the time. Ships sink. I mean, the technology itself does not preclude some unfortunate accidents. So I suppose if you were, I don't think the idea is that the ones that crash supposedly are the UFOs that come from another star system. I think the idea is that a mothership comes between star systems and sends down a little scout craft, and those are the things that have their problems. But
the good driver stays on the mothership.
The driver, yeah. So it's not unreasonable, I suppose, although it is really strange that that we would have so many of these cases. And actually, the thing is, when you actually look at the cases, most of them do have some pretty simple explanations, although there are some that are really, really odd. And a number of years ago, I put together a list of crashes in Canada, or supposed crashes or hard landings or whatever in Canada. And people were, they were kind of interested and they got some hits, but it's recently that people are really interested in this sort of thing. And there's other cases I didn't even include in that list. In fact, one that I had completely forgotten about, but has some relevance to what's going on right now. So in November of 2006, I had started getting some calls from people who had said that there were, did I hear about the crashed UFO near Steinbach, Manitoba? Now that's a city that's a little bit southeast of Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. And it's in the farming country. And the story was that people had reported seeing suspicious aircraft contrails in the sky. Okay, standard. But then they were startled to see numerous flashing lights and then ambulances, fire trucks, and they were moving right through farming fields. And then people had said not only that, but on the ground, people were seeing creatures or people wearing spacesuits, shiny spacesuits in the fields. And excuse me. And the media started taking an interest in this too. But I was getting all these calls, and what do you do about this sort of thing? Well, it turns out that it wasn't aliens, but the Canadian Food Inspection Agency was having an avian influenza outbreak exercise. 2006.
Wow.
And they are having pandemic preparedness exercises in Manitoba.
What a way to freak out a small town.
Holy cow.
Yeah, that's all they need is like you're running some kind of thing like that, and some UFO researcher manages to take a few photos, and all of a sudden you're famous.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah.
Yeah, but we have even like something like that aside. When I think of Canada's two biggest UFO stories, both of them involve some kind of object either crashing or landing. I'm thinking Shag Harbor as well as Falcon Lake. Both are, although Shag Harbor is a more typical crash. It appears the story is that something came from the sky and went into the water. Falcon Lake, it sounds more like the thing landed.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's no question that that Falcon Lake isn't it really in the same category. But yeah, absolutely, Shag Harbor, has all the elements that we talk about. On December 3rd, 1979, Shag Harbor. Boy, that was a big story.
What's the date?
Oh wait, you're not talking about that Shag Harbor crash.
What are you pranking me here? Is there two?
No. I've been going through. I've been keeping track of the government documents and what's in the National Research Council files and the RCAF files. And on December 3rd, 1979, at somewhere around 6:45 in the evening, Ralph Smith in Shag Harbor, who was just 300 yards from the water, and also Chris Smith, who also lived in Shag Harbor, saw an object shaped like a shiny semicircle with red and yellow light underneath. Appeared to look like a parachute even. It was observed to the southeast of Shag Harbor, seen for 5 minutes, and the object descended and disappeared into the sea.
Wow.
That's not the Shag Harbor you're talking about.
That's not what I was thinking
You're
of.
talking about some other one. Oh, okay.
Well, why is this not well known? This is the first I've ever heard of this, and
Yeah, it's on file, and I documented it in some of my earlier posts, and however, it's actually not even in my list of some of the crashes onto Canada in my blog post that I posted back in 2016. Turns out there's even other ones, but not in Shag Harbor, but in Nova Scotia, where objects were seen to fall into the ocean and the RCMP investigated.
Wow.
So it's just how things go. It's really quite interesting.
What I find interesting about that, I think you said 79 Shag Harbor event, and you got to send me some info on that, because what's interesting about it is what happened in 67 in Shag Harbor is a really big deal. The Canada's Roswell, the whole 9 books, documentaries about it. It didn't become a big story until well after 79. So my initial thought would be it would be kind of like a copycat thing, like I also saw a UFO.
Right.
But in 79, the 67 sighting or crash landing in Shag Harbor wasn't like a well-known like local phenomenon the way it is now. So that's compelling.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that we have that plus so many others as well.
Mm-hmm. Give me some others, because I really like the 67 Shag Harbor story I've covered on this show. That was the UFO crash that has to this day remain unsolved or unexplained, although you have a strong opinion. You were the bucket of cold water I threw in the face of the listeners at the end of my Shag Harbor episode where you presented your theory. Falcon Lake is more of a how would you describe the UFO's or the object's behavior in that? Did he just recollect? Did he just happen upon like one that was just like parked or something?
Well, he was doing so. Stefan Mihalik in 1967 was an amateur rock hound, and he just loved rocks and prospecting and all that sort of stuff. And he was doing his thing at lunchtime. Had stopped for lunch around noon on the May long weekend. It was a nice warm day. And this, for all intents and purposes, a Hollywood-style flying saucer seemed to land just not far away from him. He walked up to it. He touched the side of it with his rubberized glove, which melted. A big blast of hot gas hit him in the chest, setting his clothes on fire, setting some of the leaves and pine needles on fire. He was eventually treated in a hospital, and the case was investigated by the RCMP, the RCAF, even the United States Air Force came up to take a look. And, there was never any official explanation for what happened. In fact, the RCMP and DND said they had no explanation. And what do you do with cases like that? It's very strange, but it wasn't a crash. I mean, although the idea was that perhaps this was some sort of American secret weapon space test, something that went astray and happened to land in Canada. Because Falcon Lake is just a matter of about 100 kilometers north of the American border, probably less than that.
Interesting.
50 or 75. So yeah.
In you're famous or infamous for being a skeptic or a debunker, and for people who are only listening and don't see the video, I'm using air quotes. But you're always someone who you can take these wild stories and you usually can find like a logical explanation that often convinces me to see things your way. With Falcon Lake, like I know that's kind of like a case that you're really close with. Do you have an opinion on what actually happened?
No. In fact, this is one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with the case, why I wrote the book on it, because it doesn't seem to have a reasonable explanation. I mean, certainly elements of it have some explanations. The radioactive piece of metal is really strange. I don't think, and it was found a year after the fact, and there's some strange things around that. Maybe that has an explanation. But the object that was seen by the witness himself, he wasn't the type of guy to make up stories. He wasn't a publicity hound. He was physically injured. There was some additional evidence found at the site, and the RCMP and RCAF both grilled this guy and his family and his friends and his workmates and associates. And they could not shake the story. And they had no idea what had happened to this guy. And I spoke to the leader of the investigation team for the RCMP back in 1967, who was still alive until last year, if you can believe it. And I had spoken to him the year before, and he had gone on to leading the criminal investigations branch in other places around the globe. And he retired back to Winnipeg here. And when I asked him bluntly, I said, "What do you think happened?" And he told me on camera that he could not explain. He has no idea what this guy had seen. And he had, interviewed thousands of people in cases where he could crack them or solve the mystery. And this was one case he couldn't.
Wow. But I guess not necessarily a UFO crash. So let's get onto that.
Okay.
You probably know more about UFOs in Canada than any sane person should. So I'm sure you got a lot of UFO crash cases to tell me about, other than the 79 Shag Harbor one. So I'm ready for Canadian UFO crash class.
Okay, here we go. Here's one that everybody knows about. Francis Gary Powers. Now, we're Canadians, so we should be excused for not knowing this name automatically, but historians should know that Francis Gary Powers was an American pilot of the U-2 spy plane. And he crashed in the Soviet Union And he was held prisoner. And that, of course, because those the Soviets at that time had the U-2 spy plane, it really compromised the entire espionage thing. So it was a really, really big thing in the middle of the Cold War back in 1960. Curiously enough, another U-2 spy plane crashed in Saskatchewan, and nobody has heard of this. It turns out that another pilot had engine problems and had to make an emergency landing on March the 15th in 1960 in northern Saskatchewan on a very remote lake called Wapaweka Lake, which turns out to be very close to the Manitoba border. And this pilot had to be rescued by RCMP from Flin Flon, Manitoba. And they tromped out there and, had to call it in and say, this big plane fell from the sky. And it's really quite remarkable. And it has been documented. The CIA had comments on this. This is part of Canadian history, but it wasn't a UFO necessarily, but a U-2.
That's like the next best thing.
Absolutely.
That must have been an awkward call where he's like, I was flying a top secret espionage spy plane and had engine trouble above Saskatchewan.
Yeah, exactly. And what were they doing above Saskatchewan?
Yeah, they're spying on the farmers because there's not much out there. That must be. But the U-2, unless I could be wrong, but is that not a plane that flies like really, really high?
Yeah, they fly at 60 to 100,000 feet.
Mm-hmm. So they could have easily just been passing over on their way to somewhere.
Possibly, yeah, probably going over the pole to Russia or something.
Here's a thought too. As you mentioned that happened kind of like during the Cold War. What year was it that this happened?
1960.
Yeah. So like in Canada, the Cold War era is kind of like the heyday of Canadian UFO stories with Falcon Lake and Shag Harbor and so many others from back then. And I think like that would have been a time where people were really kind of maybe paranoid or maybe cautious.
Paranoid.
Just because of the kind of the nature of the world. And we're kind of in a separate renaissance today in 2021 of UFO stories with everything going on across the world with it. But although we're not in like a Cold War, there is a lot of China this and Russia and spies. Like I feel like we're kind of in like this new modern version of a Cold War, and I wonder if that's why we're having so much discussion in the mainstream of like UFOs and weird things in the sky.
Well, I think so. In fact, I've heard some experts say we are in a new Cold War. Absolutely. Tensions are very high between the United States and Russia. And China, so you've got this triad of major powers, and people are really nervous because Russian aircraft are flying incursions over the United States and into the Canadian North. In fact, the Canadian North is prime for this sort of thing right now. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we're in an era when there's some nervousness about what's going on up there.
Mm-hmm. And then when you think of like back in the 60s when there was the thoughts of, these experimental jets and stuff coming over to spy on us, the stuff we would have today would be beyond the wildest imaginations of the peoples back in the 60s with drones and everything else. So it's like it is reasonable now to think that some of the things we're seeing could very likely or very well be some kind of spy intelligence gathering equipment.
Sure. Yeah, it's completely reasonable.
And even Shag Harbor plays into that, right? Wasn't if I remember correctly, your theory about the Shag Harbor crash of '67 had to do with film canisters?
Yeah, and one theory that I thought was quite attractive was that there was a program called the Corona Spy Satellite program, which was so classified that information about it actually wasn't released until the 90s. Wow. And this is something that was flying in the 50s and 60s. And we do know that what was happening is that the satellite would go up and take film, because that was before digital, of whatever flying over Russia or wherever, and then drop it. And and release it down into the atmosphere. And there were aircraft that would chase this package that was dropped from space, and literally catch it, and sometimes not even catch it, but allow it to fall into the water, and then retrieve it. So we know that this program was going. One thing I noted is that there was nothing on that day that's officially known, but of course we don't know if we have all the records of all the secret flights. So I mean, it's possible, but I mean, that's something that we knew was falling into the ocean off Nova Scotia, because we do know that the U.S. Navy base, which was a little ways away from Shag Harbor, but not that far, was in operation. And not only that, people are talking about Shag Harbor in terms of, what was the Navy doing there, and there was some underwater operations. Well, there's also the underwater microphones and secret listening devices that were being laid on the seafloor around there by the United States as well. So there was all sorts of possibilities of activity that might play or might have played into the Shag Harbor story in some way. So I wouldn't rule it out, and that's it's a possibility.
Wow. It's cool where even if it isn't like an extraterrestrial craft crashing into the water in a small fishing community, there's still so much other fascinating kind of elements to the story.
Sure. And also in 1960, in addition to the U-2, there was something weird that fell into Clan Lake in the Northwest Territories. In June of that year, there was a hunter that was dropped off by a seaplane at this place called Clan Lake. It's some distance away from Yellowknife. And after the plane left, he was sort of making camp and that sort of thing. And he heard a loud noise. And he looked into the sky, couldn't figure where it was coming from. So he went back to working on his pack. And all of a sudden, he heard something fall from the sky and turned around just in time to see an object splashing into the water, rotating as it did, and throwing out water in all directions. And there was there's no steam to suggest that it was hot, but it seemed to be about 4 to 6 feet wide, with spokes coming out of it like arms.
Wow! And
as this thing spun down, a rush of water sort of came towards him and caused waves to hit the shore. And then this object sank beneath the waves. Well, this guy, grabbed the canoe and went out there to try and figure out. And there was this gouge that was, just in the reeds along the shoreline. And some of the reeds were sort of floating on the water because they had been ripped out and it looked like something was under the water. Well, he tried poking it with whatever sticks he had, couldn't reach down far enough. But he went back to his stuff, and then he eventually reported this one about a month later to the RCMP, who flew out there, had longer poles, and tried to find whatever was under the water. Nothing could be found. The RCMP in turn notified the National Research Council, who thought maybe it was a meteorite, which would have mean that was valuable, and then something that large certainly would have had some value. And so, but by this time, the water had started to get cold, and by the time the NRC got its act together, the lake had frozen over. Well, they were contracting people to fly in with magnetometers to try and find out, if they could find this thing under the ice. And there was discussion and correspondence that I found in the archives going back for, it covered a period of years. And eventually the National Research Council just said, you know what, let's just forget about it. We'll never get this thing. So there's two problems with that. One is a meteorite that fell from the sky and made such a big impression and, ripped up the reeds and whatever. Chances are that's pretty valuable. So I think there might be some scientific use to go back and look at the darn thing. And if it's not a meteorite, let's say it was a chunk of a satellite, Russian or American, you'd think that this would also be worth tracking down, because one of the other cases that I refer to was Cosmos 954. And when Cosmos 954 hit the Northwest Territories in, now was that what, 1979, something like that? I'm trying to remember now. But yes, Cosmos 1978, Cosmos 954 crashed into northern Canada near Great Slave Lake, not all that far from Clan Lake, by the way. And it was a major operation. The United States flew up immediately with radiation detectors because Cosmos 954, the Russian satellite, had a nuclear reactor on board that was powering it. It was a spy satellite, had a lot of reason to retrieve this. And basically, the United States and some joint operations combed through the snow and ice for weeks and months trying to find every piece. And they found and removed pieces as small as a pencil point.
Wow. Why would they need to do that?
Well, some of it was radioactive. They wanted to remediate as much as possible. But they also wanted to make sure that, of course, this was in an area where Inuit were living. They had to, make sure that it was safe for people to continue to live in the area. Chunks of this reactor were eventually taken down to, oddly enough, Manitoba, the White Shell Nuclear Research Establishment, which is also where Stefan Michalak, who had the Falcon Lake case, that's where he was taken for an analysis to find out whether he was somehow radioactive from what happened. So there is all sorts of these intricate connections all over the place. And, Clan Lake was 1960, Cosmos 954 was 1978. And in October of 1967, that was Shag Harbor. But before that, there was something that was seen to fall into Wollaston Lake in Saskatchewan, 1968. Where nobody saw this thing fall, but pieces of a satellite or some metal were found and tested. It was found to be 99% pure titanium, and it was described at the time as the largest piece from a satellite that has ever landed on Earth. This was 1968.
Okay.
And these pieces were like this big, and they're clearly from some shielding of another satellite. And those were retrieved and examined. And people are always talking about, pieces of UFOs, and the metamaterials and all this sort of stuff. Well, this is metamaterial. This is titanium with all sorts of sheathing and layers and so forth that had actually come from space. And whereas the metamaterial pieces that people are talking about usually with regard to UFOs are really tiny, like this big, these Wollaston Lake samples were like feet wide.
Okay.
And, and they were obtained and they were examined and tested. And the Cosmos 954, I think the largest piece was 4 or 5 feet long, and was in fact radioactive. So if something crashes, and it's reported and the United States or Canada investigates, it's documented very, very well. And in the case of 954, the report listed dozens and dozens and dozens of locations. Like this thing was scattered across hundreds of kilometers in the Canadian North and was mapped very, very carefully. So it shows exactly what would happen if a UFO was to crash, because these were thought to be UFOs, but were found to be, mundane objects, except for the Clan Lake. We still don't know what that was. But it shows you that there is a documentation on a paper trail investigating what was seen.
Yeah, I guess especially so if it's like radioactive material and stuff. I'm sure there's a lot of different reports and stuff. I'm just thinking like if your oil tank leaks, there's all these environmental kind of checks and balances that have to happen. I'm assuming if you find like radioactive metals, there's probably other, similar kind of processes that have to be followed.
Well, as a matter of fact, in the case of Cosmos 954, there was an environmental impact study done for wildlife, because there were some protected species that lived in these areas where some of these pieces were found. And so, the Wildlife Federation had to get involved too. Like this was a big, big deal. And even though, Cosmos 954 was just a matter of 40 years ago, who remembers that now?
And you do the UFO report every year, like the Canadian UFO survey. Do you see many reports like present day of UFO crashes, or are we mostly just reporting Starlink?
Yeah, mostly UFOs these days are lights in the sky. Very rarely. In fact, this is one thing that I've been able to document because of the Canadian UFO survey, partially because we started in the 80s. And even by that time, the number of close encounters of the second kind where evidence is left were really few and far between. In fact, one of the projects that myself and my colleagues are working on is backfilling beyond earlier than 1989, looking to document the UFO cases in Canada, and it became very obvious that the evidence cases and the crash cases and all that sort of thing, they really petered out in the, I would say, 70s, and were almost completely non-existent by about the 80s, and then we got into the crop circle era in the 80s, and it was really strange because most of those had no associated UFO reports whatsoever with these crop circles that were just found. But at the same time, the rings or lands, or ground markings were almost unheard of past that time. So it's almost like the crop circles took the place of that. Now that the crop circle phenomenon has waned, although every year we still hear some classic cases from England and other places, by and large, evidence cases and trace cases are gone from the UFO literature.
Yeah. What is the trend now? Because you never really hear of I've never heard of a crop circle appearing. We had the monolithic things last year for a little bit, but now it's always something in the sky.
Yeah, which is what most UFOs are, lights in the sky. But it's true. The close encounters is something that leaves behind something of its passing. Very, very rarely do we get those now. But I think what we've seen a shift to, and this comes out of the Pentagon report, of course, is that there's instrumented detection, radar,
yes,
infrared, all that sort of stuff.
The gun cameras.
Which we did have a little bit before, but that is more of the hard evidence. And for me, I don't know, radar and infrared is not necessarily hard evidence. It's certainly more, not even tangible. Tangible is the wrong word, but it's certainly a better evidence than just, an eyewitness, because you have some record of it.
Yeah.
But that seems to be where we're going for in terms of documentation anyways.
I don't know why I asked that, because as soon as you answered, I'm like, yeah, of course that's where it's going. If you think of the big cases from the last few years and everything that's kind of leading up to what's going on in the US right now, it's all like American military fancy cameras that keep track of speed and all this stuff, like the gun cameras, I think FLIR, FLIR cameras.
Yeah.
But it's like every UFO sighting now is like one of those videos that like some US ship leaks or whatnot. But that's the thing now. But at least that has a scientific angle, and there's no speculation on what the eyewitness saw or something. You have like actual data to go with, which is that's cool.
Yeah, although in the case of what the Pentagon has been, what's been leaked, and the Pentagon admits, yes, it came from a military personnel. The Pentagon itself doesn't say that they're unexplained, but it says that they're part of their study. A lot of those have some explanations. I mean, as much as UFO fans want to insist that they're not. I mean, this pyramid, which was actually a triangle, that's actually strobing at about the same rate as an aircraft, and the infrared aperture is exactly that shape. You get these things that they probably have some explanations. Even the one of the object that the fairly new one that's moving across, or seems to be moving back and forth and then drops down a little bit into the water. when you actually stabilize that image, it's not moving back and forth at all. It's just dropping slowly down to the water. And that literally can be anything.
Yeah.
And it's also racked out to the limit, almost to infinity. So it's pixelated. It's not proof of anything really.
Mm-hmm.
But the eyewitness reports of the pilots, that's something different, because one would think that Navy pilots, or Air Force pilots for that matter, who have some significant air flying time, would be able to tell, whether it's a drone or a balloon or whatever. And if they say something's flying circles around their aircraft, I don't know what that is. And that's basically what the Pentagon said. We don't have any evidence of aliens, but we're not entirely sure what was actually seen, which is kind of a Weasley way of doing it. But what's curious for me about the Pentagon thing is it's exactly what happened in history. Project Blue Book folded and the Condon Report came out, and basically they said, yeah, we're not sure what this stuff is. It's not aliens, but well, here's a bunch of cases we couldn't explain. 1952, the Air Force had a press conference talking about UFOs, or the flying saucers, and the Pentagon spokesperson says, yeah, we don't think it's aliens in any way. We don't know what's been seen, but we don't think it's aliens. Almost word for word for what we have this year. And it's like, don't people realize that history is repeating itself and that it's playing out exactly like it's happened before? And I know a lot of people are distrustful of the military and the government, and I'm fairly certain it doesn't matter what comes out of the Pentagon, nobody's going to believe it.
No, I feel the exact same way, no matter what the answer is, but I'm not expecting any great revelation from it. I'm sure it's just going to be fodder for History Channel documentaries and podcasts.
It's definitely not disclosure, that's for sure.
Yeah, and when I looked at what we've been talking about here, you have the blog post where you went through a bunch of different Canadian UFO crashes. One that you mentioned is a story that's close to me geographically, but I don't know much about it. The Ebenezer PEI UFO.
Yeah, Ebenezer,
because that involves a UFO or a purported UFO craft. But that's a story I've always been like, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole someday, but I just haven't gotten there yet. What's the story with Ebenezer, and when did that happen?
Yeah, it's really strange. August 22nd, 1990, something happened on Prince Edward Island. It was about 7:45 at night. Shirley Yo of Ebenezer, she saw a glowing object land in the woods. And they watched this object. She described it like an ice cream cone. And once it landed, she said it was still glowing hours later. And people in the area had said they were watching it through the trees. It looked like a big round ball of light. And then as they were watching, these military helicopters started flying all over the place, circling the area. And people had no idea what was going on. This was something quite remarkable. The RCMP confirmed they had like a dozen calls about the object and sent people to investigate. One officer said that he could see it in the distance and then lost sight of it. And it's very strange. So this was investigated, and the Charlottetown Astronomy Club searched the area itself the next morning and couldn't find anything. And it from the description, like an ice cream cone. That's a classic description of a bright fireball or meteor. It looks like a long blue or green teardrop, but the color was wrong. The fact that the light persisted for quite some time, very, very strange. And even the president of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada local chapter said it couldn't possibly be a meteorite. It had to be parts of a satellite. And Paul Delaney, who most people will recognize, he's on TV all the time on CTV or CBC, from York University in Toronto. He was probably not a meteor, and he thought it was some sort of satellite. However, NORAD and CFB Halifax were asked about what was going on, and they said, the UFO is nothing but a meteor, and neither military agency would say if anything struck the ground whatsoever. Now, what's curious is that there had been other reports of objects in the sky that night from New Brunswick and other parts of the Maritimes. And since then, some people from the Prince Edward Island UFO group, Facebook group, have actually went out to Ebenezer with metal detectors, and they, talked with more people. And the latest I heard, and this came up just a matter of about a week ago now, that they found these large indentations in the ground in the area of the woods where the light was seen. I mean, this, unfortunately, we're talking, 30 years ago, so it's unlikely that, one would think it would be unlikely that there'd still be something to be found. But great for the local UFO gang to try and, reinvestigate a cold case, because you never know, there might be some clues to what happened back then.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about the idea that if a meteorite crashes, it has, and actually touches down on Earth, it has value. Why is that? Is it just like the precious metals or whatever it would contain? Why are they worth money?
Well, any meteorite found now offers clues to the formation of the solar system and adds valuable information. There are cases where certain types of meteorites have compositions that are unusual. There are actually a class of meteorite that seems to come from other astronomical bodies, and it gives us some insight into how we got here. In addition to the metal itself, of course, but not all meteorites are metal. Some are just stony. But even that tells us something of the body that it came from. It wasn't a metal-rich; it was some sort of rocky object. So it gives us an idea of astronomically what's going on up there.
Interesting. Any other crashes that you think are notable before I start telling you about some UFO events that I get your opinions on?
Well, one that I really puzzled over and was Etsicom, Alberta. And a number of people in 2001 had seen something fall to the earth in this, very, very, sparsely populated region of Alberta. And the next day, a crater was found in the ground. And, when I say crater, it looks like a crater. It was as big as a car, as long as a car, and it had the raised rim, and it was, hollow in the center, and it appeared overnight. Now, this was actually investigated by some scientists from the University of Lethbridge, and was also investigated by the Astronomy Society. And because it looked like a meteor crater, and yet they didn't find any meteorite inside. Although the Lethbridge scientists said that it's probably a fragment of a meteorite or a metallic solid object that fell to the Earth from outer space, very high speed, probably 500 kilometers an hour, and it sort of threw up this crater. However, astronomers looked at it, and Alan Hildebrand of the University of Calgary, who is the leading authority on impact craters in not just Canada but around the world, he was actually the one who broke the news about dinosaurs dying off from the meteorite or asteroid that hit Mexico. In his opinion, and this is somebody who knows his stuff, he didn't think that Etsicom was made by a meteorite. It was something else. So if it was not caused by something falling from space, what was it? And it's a mystery. We have no explanation for what fell onto Etsicom, Alberta.
Interesting. It kind of reminds me a bit of another event on your list with the Bell Island boom, which is
Bell Island boom. Yeah.
Yeah, there's like in Bell Island, Newfoundland. I did a multi-part series, and I also interviewed Cynthia Bickford, she was only a child at the time, but she lived in and still lives in the house that was like ground zero for where it went down on what they call the Bickford Farm. But that's also a story where like there's no question something happened, but there's no explanation for it. I think people who listen to my show, especially that have listened for years, probably remember that story. But I don't think we've ever talked about it. Are you big on the Bell Island boom?
Well, I mean, I know I've read the scientific theory that it was caused by a superbolt, which seems reasonable. It's also suspicious that 78, which is when this happened, is also the time of the Concorde. And there's no question that a lot of the booms off the coast of the eastern seaboard of the United States and Canada were caused by the Concorde breaking the sound barrier. So it was either a Concorde boom or a superbolt. And I think the reason they said it was a superbolt was because they've been monitoring lightning using their satellites. And I think the Velas satellite suggested that a superbolt had occurred somewhere in Newfoundland on or around that time. So that's where that comes from. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it sure caused quite the thing.
Definitely. Now, here's how I want to end this: is anytime I get the UFOs Above Canada Facebook group, I give people the option to report a UFO sighting. It sends me all the information in an email, and as I get them, I forward them right off to you. And there's been a lot of them in the last month. Even roughly, like how many emailed UFO reports do you think I've sent you? I think probably 30 or something.
Over the past month or so?
Yeah, I feel like I'm sending one every second day.
Yeah, probably a dozen or so, maybe 15, something like that.
Yeah,
and of course that's just. I mean, that's not all of them. I mean, we get stuff sent to us directly. There's stuff that's posted in the web pages themselves. Stuff from MUFON, stuff from Peter Davenport, and so forth.
Their friends.
So there are cases that are continually being reported. I think the thing to remember too is that the number of UFO reports is still down compared to last year. As many as we're getting now, it's not making up for the hundreds that we were getting at this time last year. So it's curious that during the pandemic, the explanation why we're getting so many reports is because of the pandemic in 2020. 2021, we're still in lockdown, and yet the number of UFO reports is not as high as it was the previous year. Why that's so?
Yeah,
I have no idea.
And UFOs get as much or more attention as ever right now. It seems like.
Well, there's a difference though. Media attention, such as what we're seeing right now on CNN and ABC and Pentagon and all that sort of stuff. Traditionally, and I've done studies of media content and UFOs. An increase in media attention does not generate current reports. In fact, what happens is somebody will be watching, Barack Obama talk about UFOs on James Corden, and they'll say, "Oh, you know what? I saw something when I was a kid," and they'll make that report. So we get older reports, but not necessarily current reports.
Interesting.
And so that's the difference.
I have a current report for you. This is one
let's hear it.
This is from your neck of the woods, and this is one that came from through the reporting forum on UFOs Above Canada's Facebook group. It's from Winnipeg, Manitoba, your neck of the woods, 29th of May, about 5 p.m. So I'm just going to read you the witness's description.
Sure.
So what they say is, a large metallic, highly reflective sphere flew over us at a very low altitude while flying a kite. It was a very clear day. It flew from south to north over the Minto Armory in Winnipeg. It was very windy that day, and it seemed to be completely unaffected by the wind. It flew very stably over us and past the Minto Armory, disappearing over the building. 5 or 10 minutes later, it flew over us again at the same approach and then moved down in a very controlled manner behind the building. My girlfriend and I could not figure out how it could be flying that way, especially in the wind. They say that the sighting took about 3 minutes, each sighting, with about 5 minutes between them. Yeah, I don't know what I think of that.
Yeah, it's pretty strange. Minto Armory is actually in the very center of Winnipeg. It's a holdover for when there were some troops stationed in some bases in Winnipeg from the 1940s. Very old building. I think it's actually used as a COVID injection site now or something like that. So it's strange that it would be right over the center of the city. The description, the fact it was taking 3 minutes to pass, kind of sounds balloonish.
And large spherical object, like you see those kind of big balloons that are like metallic.
Yeah. If I was to, have to explain it, that's probably what I would lean in the direction. But that was mystifying to these two witnesses, and they said there was like either the same one came back and did it again, or it was a second one. Yeah,
and when they say at the same approach, they would mean like flew in the same direction, so which wouldn't really.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I haven't had a chance to follow up on this one. It's been a little hectic, but this would be one to investigate a little bit more.
Well, I got another one, and this one I definitely want to get your opinion on, because it involves a UFO event that occurred over a nuclear power plant in Pickering, Ontario. My old stomping grounds. I lived there for a summer.
That's why you're glowing now.
Yeah, this sighting lasted just a little over 6 minutes. It happened on the 24th of May at 9:30 p.m. So I'll describe it to you here. So the witness describes it as 4 to 5 orange lights, very slowly moving, one at a time, came from the water behind the nuclear plant. They would get to a certain point in the sky and then vanish, and another one would come from behind the other lights, like they were trading places. And a couple of times the lights would just vanish. And there was 2 that stayed for quite a while at the beginning. There was a lineup of like 4 of them to a certain place in the sky, and then they'd vanish. They looked to be something smaller. They looked to be something smaller than a dime when we were to look at them in the sky. Multiple witnesses from people on our balconies watched the fireworks. We're watching fireworks. One sec. Multiple witnesses from people on our balconies watching the fireworks. It was almost as if they positioned themselves over where the fireworks were to watch them. So there must have been fireworks going on. They're watching the fireworks as this occurs.
Well, that's the May long weekend, of course. That's
May
Victoria
24th.
Day weekend. Yeah, and that's the weekend was the 24th, and so that's what the fireworks were going. And I suspect that's also what these things were, not fireworks, but Chinese lanterns. That's the perfect description. Orange lights rising and then vanishing after a while. And you can just imagine that they're lit one at a time.
Yes.
And the fact that they're over Pickering nuclear plant is really kind of the red herring, because anything between Toronto and Montreal is going to be over the Pickering plant. It's the regular flight path from all aircraft flying west to east and east to west. So whether it was something deliberately over the plant or just, of course, and the plant's on the water too. So there's beaches. There's all sorts of
there's lots of walking trails and parks in there too. So I could see people lighting. It's a large open area, so that would be a spot where people may set off Chinese lanterns. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's my guess what these were, but they look kind of cool. I remember we did a demonstration for there's a show on APTN called Indians and Aliens, where we set one off and they filmed it from the time I lit it to the time it disappeared in the distance, and it looked pretty cool.
Neat. I've never seen one in real life, like up close. I know what they are. It's like a paper ball with a candle in it.
Yeah.
And then the heat from the candle will make the ball or the paper shape float
off.
Yeah,
back in the 1950s and 60s, we used to make them from dry cleaner bags, and you'd get this is instructions for how to do it. You get balsa wood from a hobby shop, balsa wood for making hobby planes. 2 long strips, cross them up, and then get some sort of ring. And I forget what we used as the paper ring, but you got a dry cleaner bag attached to these balsa wood, and in the center you'd put a little can of sterno or some heat source. Candles by themselves wouldn't work necessarily, but you might be able to make a tea light, a couple of tea lights and stuff. And then you have to wait for the heat to actually fill the bag. The dry cleaner bag's pretty big. And when it was finally heated, you could let it go and it would rise very slowly.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a good explanation. See, you're so good at this. I can just pitch this stuff, and you always get a good explanation.
Well, and you called me a debunker, and what's interesting is a good UFO investigator can explain most cases. Mm-hmm. So is explaining UFO reports debunking? I think a debunker is more somebody who refuses to even consider UFOs as anything other than bunk. And I don't think UFOs are bunk necessarily, especially with regard to some of these pilot cases and the number of cases that we have on file. Oh, by the way, the Pentagon said that they looked at 120 cases over the past 20 years. Well, over the past 20 years, I have 350, 3 times as much pilot and military reports of UFOs in Canada alone.
Wow.
So the numbers don't add up, or they add up wrong down in the Pentagon.
Take that. Now who should be running the country?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this has been eye-opening, Chris. I always enjoy talking about this stuff. I look forward to whatever weird thing comes up next. The UFO survey for this year is going to be a while away, but I'm sure some more interesting stuff. I'll have you back on when the Pentagon report's released officially, and we'll go through it.
Okay, and don't forget my next book is coming out July the 31st.
It is. What is? Okay, give us some
title.
info on this.
I can tell you the title now. It's called Canada's UFOs Declassified.
You've already talked about the number of military Canadian UFO sightings, so I think I got a pretty good idea what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. It's so timely.
Yeah. So it's not coming out. It's later than I thought. There's been some delays from the publisher, but July 31st is the scheduled date right now.
When did you start working on it? I'm just curious how long you spent.
This has been a while in the works, because I went through all the National Research Council files, plus some additional files, and picked out some of the favorites, some of the really interesting ones, and actually the book is going to reproduce quite a lot of the official documents, so
awesome.
People are able to see for themselves. So I've been working on this for a couple of years for sure.
When the Pentagon report's out, you're on. When that book's released, I will read a copy and then we'll talk about it.
It's a deal.
I want to thank you for joining Chris Rutkowski and I for our talk tonight. Hopefully, in the near future, more UFOs will crash into our planet, and we'll be able to do it again soon. But until then, I'll be looking for more stories about the ones that managed to stay airborne. And with that, I'll begin to wrap this episode up. But first, a big thanks to Chris Rutkowski for again sharing his time and his knowledge with us. As well, a big shout out to Monty Datta for contributing the music for this episode. What you heard was a piece called Noir Tokyo. And lastly, a massive thank you to everyone who listens to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. But with that said, keeping the show alive is and has always been an uphill battle. So if you want to help keep the grass cut around here, please consider subscribing to the premium feed. For about the price of a cup of coffee, you can help the show out at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. And with that said, let me thank the newest supporters of the show. Blaine, Rob, Maureen, and Lynn, thank you for your generous support. If anyone listening has any story ideas or wants to give feedback on the show, find me at nighttimepodcast.com/contact or on social media. I use Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I'm often live on the Nighttime Podcast YouTube channel. So that's it. Until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.